don't know what you've been told about Jesus' invitation, that he loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, that if you pray a certain prayer, you will go to heaven when you die, that if you commit to following him, you won't have any more problems in your life. I don't know what you've been told, but if you're like most, it was abbreviated or completely misrepresented. The real invitation is aggressive, it's bold, and it takes a healthy dose of God's power coupled with human effort. But it's also for now, not later. Character transformation, not behaviour modification. Jesus invites you to attune your character to his, to possess a heart and life like his. Nobody is saying you can earn it. It'll take God's grace. Nobody is saying it'll be easy. It'll take hard work. But what if you really could attune your character to his, and in doing so, discover a whole new way of being human? If your life feels unmanageable, Jesus thinks he can help.
Top of the morning. Speaking of Australians, we did get some good news this week. Some of you know that the person who is going to come lead our music and arts department is a gal named Kate who lives in Sydney, Australia, and we're working on an R1 visa. And what we learned this week was that our visa application was approved upon condition of our site visit, which means that the application itself was approved, which is kind of a big deal. It lay for a while, looked like it was going to be rejected, and we had to submit some more information. So that in and of itself is an accomplishment. Now what they have to do is some federal agents have to come visit the Narrate offices to confirm that you all are real, like that we exist, that we do this, that we're really a church, not a terrorist cell. And I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's also, you can see why that needs to be done. So we have reason to be hopeful that we'll get that scheduled this week, and what that does once we get that scheduled is gives us a lot of clarity about the timelines. So thanks for praying, those of you that are doing that. Also, if I could just say that Special Olympics deal, if you're feeling a little bit of cabin fever, that's our thinking there is, man, next Sunday we'll go out, we'll spend a few hours in the afternoon helping Special Olympic kids do their track meet and be together, and it should be a blast. So we really encourage you to think about that. I think it's a neat opportunity to matter in our community, and I love how it complements Ales for Trails. Like, lest you get caught up on the fact that we're raising funds with beer, then we go, okay, pendulum opposite. Let's just go serve people. So there you go. Do you ever give thought to what's going to take you out if you get taken out? Do you ever give thought to if you sabotage your own life via a stupid decision of some sort? Do you ever give thought to what exactly that decision will consist of? What it'll look like? What type of decision it'll be? Something that I'm thinking about and something that I want us to explore this morning, because I think it really wraps itself around what Jesus is getting after in the Sermon on the Mount. I was thinking this week that one of my favorite events in the 9 years that I had the opportunity to lead student ministry was on 2 occasions in consecutive summers. Actually, we took a handful of students. Actually, it was 40-some the first year and 20 the next year. We took them to San Francisco, and we did what we called an urban mission trip, and there's an organization called the Center for Student Missions that we worked with, and what they do is they broker relationships with all the nonprofits, all the 501c3s, the government agencies, Christian or otherwise, that just provide services to people, and you'd go spend a half day serving with these different organizations. And so the experiences were myriad, because in the morning you may deliver meals to people who are homebound by HIV/AIDS, and then in the afternoon you may have worked childcare in the Tenderloin district, which is one of the most diverse districts. I think it's the most diverse district in any city in America. So it was this very, very diverse experience. But obviously part of what makes San Francisco is also that its homeless population is substantial, and it's also a teen runaway haven. And so that afforded all kinds of opportunities with students, because San Francisco is a very neat city with a lot of culture, and so and then at the same time, there's a very unhealthy underbelly to the city. And so and on one occasion, I think I've even told this story before, where I was serving in a soup kitchen in Haight-Ashbury, which Haight-Ashbury is actually an intersection, and today is a very kind of hipster place with really neat shopping. It's also where the hippie movement began in the 60s. It's also right next to a park called Golden Gate Park, which is one of the biggest in the area, and it's one of the major pipelines for runaway teens. And so I was standing with another student. Her name was Mary Alice, and we were serving in this line as people came through. And obviously, I haven't forgotten, there was this guy who came through who looked like he was in his 40s and had clearly been homeless and was clearly an addict. And behind him were two girls who didn't look like they could have been more than 16 or 17 years old. They were together. And it was clear that they weren't homeless for near as long as he had been homeless. And I mean, you can just imagine how gross that was. And Mary and I turned and made eye contact, and we instantly knew what each other was thinking, because one of the common lines that we used with one another on these trips was, what separates you from that guy in the gutter, or in this case, what separates you from this 17-year-old girl walking through line is probably just one decision. And it really confronted the tendency that many of us have to see people whose lives are exponentially more broken than ours, perhaps, and to begin to think that their life is way different than ours. And yet we would just always say, like, really, in truth, the difference between them and you is one decision. And thus, it was a remarkable thing to lead students into. What would that one decision be for you? You ever think about that? Do you ever get close to something? I mean, maybe you know, like, for me, it's going to be this. If something takes me out, it's going to be my anger. If something takes me out, it's going to be this type of decision. Do you ever think about that? Like, you've got goals. You have ambitions. You have desires. There's things that you value, whether that's your work or your business or your family. There's possessions even that you really, really cherish. Do you ever think about what single decision you could make that would cost you all of it? That would so dramatically change your life that it's hard to even comprehend, like what right turn you could take that you wouldn't know as you were taking it, perhaps, but down the road, you would find that you arrived at a destination that was dramatically different than what you went looking for. Like, maybe you're a student. Maybe you're a seventh grader. Maybe you're a junior in high school. Maybe you're in college. And the great thing about this part of life is all about hopes and dreams and ambitions and what you're going to accomplish and what you're going to do. And maybe for you it's athletics, or maybe for you it's grades, or maybe for you you're about to graduate and you want to get this job, or you're hoping to get this scholarship, and you're going to move to this city, and you're going to have this kind of car and this kind of house. And I mean, for you, life is just this giant green board, white board, where you just get to dream, and you've got all these dreams. What keeps you, or what decision could you make that would make your life look a lot more like that 16-year-old girl in a soup line in Haight-Ashbury? Maybe you're married, and anybody here who's married or been married knows that there's really no such thing as a perfectly secure marriage. And maybe you're painfully aware of the fact that just a single decision can end years of work, and you know that. Maybe you've done it, maybe you've been on the receiving end of it, maybe you've just watched friends in that situation. What decision could you make that would change everything? Maybe you're a business owner, or even you just have a job, and you love the trajectory of your business. You love where you're going. Maybe you're not in the job, but you like your job, and even more, you're on this course where you can see, like, you're working the plan, you're climbing the ladder, you're going to get there, or your business is going to get there. Did you ever consider the fact that just one decision, and it could come from a variety of different places, just one decision could change all of that? Maybe you're a person of incredible integrity and character and even spiritual conviction, and you take that very, very seriously, and you're a person who works really, really hard on your reputation, not to an unhealthy extent, but you want to be a person of character, and you're known as a person of character, and maybe even you have a spot in the community or within your community, because all things are kind of relative in that realm, and you are respected, you are looked to. Have you ever considered what could you do that could undo years, decades of respectability? Maybe you're like me, and like a lot of us in this room, you look over your shoulder, and behind you in the past that you've lived, there's a lot of carnage. Like, you can see it. I mean, no one has to tell you, you don't need me reminding you how capable you are of bringing destruction into your own life. You don't need me telling you how hard it can be to manage your own life, how impossible. In fact, you've got this past, and it confronts you with how capable you are. But maybe the last 6 months are different. The last couple years are different. The last decade's been different. And maybe you had a moment with God. Maybe you had a moment with Jesus. Maybe you went to AA. Maybe you got some help. Maybe you went to counseling. But you're aware of the tension. In fact, all these illustrations, you get it. Like you get that just in a moment's notice, you could undo the last 6 months. You could undo the last couple years. The question is, are you aware of what that would look like, how you would go about this? Like, do you ever think about these questions? It's a little dark and it's a little depressing. Sorry about that. I've been thinking about them myself, and I think about them a lot. Maybe it's because I'm a recovering pessimist. I don't know. That's a discipline for me. But I don't think so. I think it's because even when I look out over my 34 years of life, I see evidence both professionally, both when I followed Christ and when I didn't, how you can get moving in a certain direction and you can start accomplishing things and you can start checking things off the list and you can start making progress in your own character and you can start making progress with substance and you can start making progress in relationships. And then just without even really thinking about it, you can make a single decision and suddenly all that hard work unravels. And the reason that becomes so depressing is because you realize like now you've got to redo all that work and then have the energy to push past where you were. I was thinking this week about when I was in 8th grade. I mean, life for me was about sports and school and girls. Not to say that that's normal, but that's kind of where I was. And my goals weren't all that big. I just wanted to play baseball and basketball and football and hopefully get a junior college baseball scholarship. I mean, I went to school, I studied hard, I had girlfriends. But like honestly, I didn't even really think about sex. I mean, maybe you go, you're lying, you're in 8th grade, you thought about sex, but seriously, like in my relationship with girls, it just wasn't even on the radar screen. Call me prude, I'm okay with that. And drugs and alcohol, like again, not even in my mind. In fact, I remember we had a word for those kids that would like cross the school grounds and smoke. Remember, I don't know if you did this, but you called them reapers. Look at all those reapers over there. And it was this term of derision, like they were like had some horrible disease, or like, look at those reapers. I mean, it didn't have anything to do with any of that. And maybe the reason I think about this is a year later, as I was finishing up my freshman year of high school, I didn't play sports anymore. I'd been arrested for an MIP. The guy with me got a DUI. I was going to school stoned every day, and I didn't really care about school. The honor roll wasn't even a thought at that point. I mean, isn't it kind of scary you how quickly things can change and have changed? Maybe I think about this because I suppose part of the advantages of being a part of church for 14 years now, and I've had the chance to be on staff at 3 different churches and be a part of 4. And because of that, I feel like I've spent the last 14 years, really my adult life, around some of the most amazing people in Billings and now Helena. And the other thing I've seen is remarkable lives implode, like unexpectedly. Like out of nowhere. I remember being that 21-year-old couple. Teresa and I were married young, and we were part of this launch team at this church called Harvest in Billings. And I remember being the 21-year-old sitting in the room, even though I feel like the old guy now, like sitting in the room, and there were these 10 or so couples, these young 30 and 40-something couples. Some of them had little tiny kids. Some of their kids were older. And you just look at them as a 21-year-old and go like, these guys are amazing. I don't even think they sin. I mean, they're just the most remarkable people. And there was this one couple in particular that we really connected with. I think for a lot of reasons, the guy who discipled us discipled them. They both started following Jesus later in life, so we connected on that level. He was a jerk, I was a jerk, so our wives both connected that way. Had youth ministry that we did together. He was a Bronco fan, that never hurts, so we could talk about that. And they were this amazing couple, and I remember I showed up for Christmas Eve services. I can't remember if it was the first or the second year. And my friend Brian Hopkins, who leads Journey, was the executive pastor there at the time, and he said, hey, Adam, you got to usher. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. I've never ushered in my life. Where's this guy? He was our lead usher. And very quickly what I picked up on was don't ask. Don't ask. And what became clear in the next few weeks was that this guy who was a VP of a bank and a referee in the Big Sky Conference, I mean, he had it all made. His wife was beautiful. He had these little kids. Everything was healthy. That he was sleeping with his secretary. and that not only was he that come out at the company Christmas party, but that he was leaving his wife and by all appearance was leaving the faith. And I think it's given me this honest appreciation for Like things like that, they can change. Do you ever think about that? Like, I'm not suggesting that we should all assume we're going to hit a wall someday and everything's going to implode. I know it might sound like that. I'm not suggesting that we assume that. I am suggesting that it's wise to understand your capacity, your capability for that, and even more to identify if that happens, what it's most likely to look like. In other words, what I want to suggest to you this morning is that there's just a few ways that it's likely to happen. And I don't know what you do with Jesus. I don't know what you believe about him. I don't know where you fall in terms of believing he's God or not, or believing he saves us from our sins or not. But here's what I know. His insight into the human condition gives me so much confidence in him that even if you don't believe he's God, I think he's worth a listen to, because what Jesus said when he arrived on the human scene is he observed all this, he recognized this tendency, and then he went so far as to say, hey, listen here. He said, what takes you out most likely won't come from outside of you, which is somewhat of a relief. And that's not to say that tragedy can't strike, that rocks us. We're all aware of that. But most likely, what's most likely to happen is it won't be events that sabotage your life. It'll be your heart. It'll be your character. And then even better, he says, and the heart problems that you can have, the good news is there's not 10,000. There's not 1,000. Like it happens around a really small spectrum. In other words, the way Chinese people 3,000 years ago could sabotage their lives looks no different than the way people in Helena, Montana today can sabotage their lives. Like there's not a lot of creativity. If you believe in Satan, statistics would say only about half of you do, that would mean that his ability to tempt you, it looks kind of the same. And so for weeks we've been exploring Jesus in this message, his longest recorded sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. And that's really what he's getting at, is he's going, hey, listen, what's going to ruin your life is your character flaws. And so let me help you with that. So there's a positive way and a negative way to look at that. Do you see that? Like, here's what's going to destroy you, and here's the ways that we need to make sure you're well. And so I brought one of these. Staff made fun of me. But I was actually visualizing this as Caleb was teaching last week. Remember these? Now, remember when the bottom was wooden? Yeah, not so. Here's what Jesus is saying, though, if I could just say this, maybe illustrate it in a childish way. What Jesus is saying is, hey, if something's going to ruin your life, it's most likely to be your anger. Like, that's first and foremost. The way you deal with frustration, the way you deal with contempt, the way you deal with disappointment, the way you deal or don't deal with people hurting you. That's in the Sermon on the Mount. He starts by talking about anger, and he says, hey, listen, if something's going to take you out, it's probably going to be your anger. Ever wonder why you drive by a jail and you kind of shudder? Am I the only one that does that? Kind of get anxiety every time for as long as I can remember. It hit me when I was studying for this series. Like, well, I get it. I think that's the Spirit of God in us that just we all know, like, hey, our anger, we're all one decision away from being right there because of our anger. That's not a bunch of people who are capable of something that we're not. That's something we're all capable of. And then what Jesus says, and if you weren't here for Caleb unpacking the anger stuff last week, I highly recommend listening on the app or downloading the podcast. And then Jesus goes like, hey, and then there's a second one. And there's lots of ways to frame the second one. The word that Dallas Willard uses, or the words, and I like them, is he calls it fantasized desire. In other words, what Jesus is saying is if you want to give attention to what can destroy your marriage, what can knock you off the path of your goals, what could undo all the hard work you've done, Jesus says, well, there's not a lot of creativity to it, and there's actually a few more in chapter 5 that we're not going to get to, and I highly recommend you read the few pages in the book that unpack them. But first and foremost, it's likely to be your anger, and after that, it's likely to be your sexuality. And after that, there's a few other things, but if you could, think of it this way. If every human heart was well in these two areas, how much different of a place would you live in? Or let's not let ourselves off the hook. If you were whole in these two areas, how much different would your character be? That's what Jesus is doing. So this morning, I know that people just love to talk about adultery and all those different things, and so I was like, yes, we're going to serve the people and talk about that. So here we go. Matthew chapter 5. Just being honest with the text here. And let me say this, I recognize that for some of us, this is an exercise in academia. For some of us, this is a theological exercise. And for some of you, the exact opposite is true. Like this frames the pain that you feel. And so just please let me say this before we go any further. This is one of those subjects that if you allow the shame to crowd in, you won't really get to hear what Jesus has for you. So this isn't about shame. Please just like push that aside, because the reason God doesn't ever use it is because it's not productive. So I'm going to try to not trip over myself all the time and apologize, and I just want to say it that way, like, don't allow the voice of shame, because you won't get from this what Jesus has for you. Starting in verse 27 then. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Now, by now you know that this is the pattern Jesus is following in this text. He's quoting from the 10 Commandments, that the people standing there on the hill as he sat, because their teachers were smart, like you sit, you stand, I sit. The people that are there, they understand like, oh yeah, he just quoted the 10 Commandments. And of course, adultery, in its most literal form, forbids a married person from having sex with someone whom they are not married to, with someone whom they are not married. He says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully, and again, this is man, woman, we can exchange all these things. And anyone that looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. See, what Jesus is saying here, just like Caleb did with anger last week, just as he talked about last week, is he's going, hey, the goal isn't murder. The goal is your heart. The goal is who you are. And what Jesus is aware of is what we're aware of, and that is that two people cannot be involved in a literal bodily sexual relationship and still be very unwell sexually. That relationship can be way off. Further, what he's pointing out is that you cannot be committing acts of adultery in your life. And yet sexually, you can be very, very unhealthy nonetheless. And you get to decide, is it shame or is it coaching? Now, this idea, it wasn't a new idea. In fact, some theologians think that the oldest book in the Bible is the book of Job. They think the oldest hero in the Bible is Job himself. Listen to what Job says in chapter 31. If I can find it. I got lucky last service by doing the old, oh yeah, I know where I'm going. Oh yeah, there it is. Oh yeah, there it is. I made a covenant with my eyes, Job said. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. Why? What's the consequences? It's completely inconsequential. What's the big deal, Job? Nobody even knows. It's completely private. Everyone's doing it. They're not even wearing anything. How can I not? To which Job says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then may my wife grind another man's grain. If you think the Bible doesn't use metaphors, then go there. Then may my wife grind another man's grain. That actually just stood out to me as I was reading that. I'm not blushing, I'm always red. Then may my wife grind another man's grain, and may other men sleep with her. Wow, Job, you just escalated that one. What's Job saying? See, Job is a man who understands cause and effect. He understands that what I do with my eyes, what I do with my mind, it impacts my marriage to the extent that it impacts my wife's sexuality down the road. We talked a couple summers ago about this idea of the principle of the path, and what the principle of the path says is where your path is headed is what your destination is. Like you can't be heading this way and end up over there. That's what he's pointing out, that your present is your future. Like your present's not some ethereal mystery, like where am I going to end up? No. Your present is a reflection of the decisions you're making. That's what Job is saying. And he's connecting the dots saying, listen, if I'm undisciplined with my mind, I already know where my marriage is ending up. That's not a mystery. I already get it. I already see it. This is what Jesus is saying. And ultimately, when he says the adultery of the heart thing, he's pointing out that sometimes we can be doing things in our mind that the only thing missing is the overt movements of the body, and yet the heart is still there. And furthermore, sometimes the only thing missing is the opportunity. And what we all know is if the only thing missing is the opportunity, then eventually the opportunity will present itself. See, Jesus, I know this is old-fashioned. That's the tendency. And you get to decide whether or not you think that's true. But you don't get to decide, in my opinion, whether or not that statement, this is old-fashioned, is true. Because theologically and culturally and socially speaking, that type of view of sexuality it's not old, it's new. Jesus' view is new. The idea that says sexuality is completely inconsequential, see, we think, especially if you're raised in a Christian home, that the culture that we live in, that's new. That's not true. Jesus and God and the Bible, they presented this very new idea of saying, no, there's more to it than that. In fact, the sexual world of Jesus and Paul, the New Testament, dwarfs the world that you live in. It completely dwarfs it. You think it's challenging because of GoDaddy commercials? It got nothing on what went on in Corinth. In fact, imagine a world where husbands could own women. Imagine a world where husbands could own women and there were no rules as to what they could do with those women they owned. Imagine a world where husbands could own women, and then when they went to church, it was riddled with prostitutes, male and female, even goats and other animals. And that worship was literally a sexual experience. See, I tell you all that to say that when Jesus and Paul say, hey, be careful, they're not saying it to a bunch of Quakers. They're saying it to this culture that was so sexual, it dwarfs even what we experience. And listen to what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 16. He says, flee from sexual immorality. Thank you very much, preacher boy. Why? That's the question. Why? To which Paul says this, all other sins a person commits are outside the body. But whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Please do not hear Paul saying that sexual sin is worse. It is not what he just said. This isn't Dante's Inferno. There aren't different layers of hell, and all of you who have sinned sexually are over here, and you're worse than those of us who haven't. He's not saying sexual sin is worse. He's saying it's different. Different, not worse. And you know something? You know that by experience. Your greatest regrets in life, no matter how much money you've spent, how much money you've blown, how many stupid decisions you've made, your greatest regrets in life, I almost guarantee the vast majority of this room, they're sexual. The wounds that you've experienced, and you've had some terrible things done to you, the ones that were sexual, they're just in their own category. Not worse, just different. Paul, Jesus, they're saying, be careful. This stuff follows you around. This stuff, it affects your own body. It's different. This is, I heard Andy Stanley say, and I thought, I so agree with that statement. He said, it's passages like these that give him confidence in the inspiration of Scripture because their insight into the human situation is so incredible. Because they lived in a world that said, no, it's just, there's no consequence. And they went, no. It is deeply consequential in ways that are completely different than everything else. One guy said it this way, it's like the difference between being beat up and being raped. It's just different. You get to decide whether God is a prude or whether he so understands you and your character. See, that's the context here. Jesus, the question is, God, how can you give me wholeness? How can you make me new? How can you form me? And the answer is not, well, go to Bible studies. The answer is not, memorize all the verses you can. Those can help, but what he's saying is, let me help you with your character. And first and foremost, your character involves your anger and your contempt. And second to that, it involves the way you approach sexuality. I'm not talking political stuff. I'm just talking heart stuff. Now that's heavy. Here's the good news. Jesus in this statement also makes it clear that to desire is not sin. He makes it clear that finding someone attractive, even if they're not your spouse, is not sin. See, look back at 5:28. I think oftentimes, and I'm sure I've done this, especially in youth ministry years, we make this adultery of the heart thing impossible to not be crushed by. We make it impossible to obey because we assume that if you look at someone and go, man, she's pretty, well, you just sinned. That's not what he's saying. Listen, he says, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It's desiring to desire. That's the issue. He's not saying like, hey, it's wrong to find someone beautiful. He's saying, no. It's wrong to cultivate that. It's wrong to feed it. It's wrong to go looking for it. And not just wrong, unhealthy. And if you've been on the receiving end of adultery, you know exactly what he means. It's just unhealthy. See, Jesus, I've heard one guy actually say this. I think this is somewhat helpful. He says the first look isn't sin. It's the second look that's sin. See, it's what are we looking for? That's really what he's getting after. He's inviting you into a way of going, hey, I think my sexuality is part of my character. And I think I'm going to work on that. Now, here's the other good news. What he's not saying is, therefore, like, stare at your feet. I remember when we would drive to these mission trips in Mexico, we would drive on the interstate through Vegas. And I mean, those billboards are insane. And there would always be some well-intentioned seventh grade girl that would say, don't look right. What's every kid in the bus do? Look right. There's every person in the bus. The good news is Jesus, he doesn't simplify this to the extent where he says, don't. In fact, he mocks people who do. Listen, starting in verse 29. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. Now, for how many of you would that actually be helpful? I mean, seriously, like, do blind people have issues with this? See, he's making fun of the ludicrous approach that is all about behavior, not about heart. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. He's like, well, if that works, then gouge out your eyes, dudes. I remember this guy that I really liked when I was leading youth ministry. He used to say, she can be wearing a big, ugly sweater, and I can lust. It's honest. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. See, Jesus is going, hey, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I'm telling you, I'm not really all that concerned with what you do. I want your heart. I want to change you there. I want to impact who you are from the inside. And who you are is deeply connected to your sexuality. I was finishing up a run this last week. I think it was on Tuesday, and there's a house about a block away from ours, and I noticed as I ran by it, for sale by owner sign. And let me just kind of give you the context before I tell you what happened from there, because these are people that I don't know them. I don't know them personally. I know of them. I know that they're this couple. I would suspect they're in their late 70s, early 80s. I know that I've watched the husband slowly move from being able to stumble around his yard and water his flowers to now he's in a wheelchair and oxygen and still gets out there and waters his flowers. And I also know that it's a neighborhood where they raise their family, because every summer and around July, all these cars converge from different parts of the state, and all these kids and their kids are out there. And one time, one of their daughters was walking their dog in front of our house, and my kids are always enamored with dogs because my wife and I mostly don't like them. And so they were petting these people's dogs, and we had this real quick passing conversation that, oh yeah, I grew up in this neighborhood. It's always fun to come home. Those are my parents down there. So that's the context. So I ran by their house, and you know how your brain and your heart and your soul can kind of do this like that fast? You know that? See, this is the problem I have, is I think it in 10 seconds, and then it takes me 5 minutes to tell you. I had this moment where I just went, wow, Lord, hope that's my kids someday. Like, I hope that's my kids moving my wife and I out of this house on Warren that we've raised our family in and moving us into some retirement home. That's what I'm assuming, because I haven't seen those vehicles which would indicate there was a death. I'm assuming some things. But I just had this moment of, I think obviously because of this weekend of thinking, those people have that part of their character in check. Good job. And I think had an honest appreciation for the fact that if something takes me out, that's number 2 on the list, is the sexuality stuff. Listen, if you're married, my hope for you this morning is that you would leave challenged to be a little more honest with what's going on in your heart. Because not committing adultery is not really the goal. Like being a whole husband and a whole father and a whole wife and a whole mother and a whole employee, that's the goal. And if nothing else, to see that like you're not going to out of nowhere commit an act of adultery someday. You're either practicing for it or you're not. And to get really honest with yourself and potentially with others in that regard. If you're single, and maybe you're single against your own will. Maybe you're living with this struggle that you were headed in that direction. It was them who wasn't. The great thing about Jesus is we get to start our stories over. We get to start new. And there's examples of couples in this room who did that decades ago. But here's the bottom line, if you will, because I understand that like the last thing you need is another message that says, be pure, stupid. It doesn't have a goal. The goal is someday you're going to meet him. Someday you're going to meet her, and it's going to be to that point where you're starting to think it's him and you're starting to think it's her, and you're going to sit down. And if they're the type of person that you deserve to marry, there's going to be this intentional conversation of like, hey, so what's your sexual past look like? And you might get to go, well, I messed this one up for quite a few years, but I've been working hard on it for the last year. And not just for you, but because I understand it's central to who I am. And in that moment, she's going to be thinking, boy, I thought he was a little short, but suddenly he seems taller. Wasn't so sure about her hair, but suddenly I don't care about the hair. That's what you're shooting for. You're not shooting to like feel like that you fit in Christian community because you're none of that stuff. You're shooting for a marriage that you're working for now. And if you're someone that has dealt with divorce, again, I sure hope that you don't allow shame to take this conversation over. The question is, are you going to tell that story in your current marriage? I was talking to a friend this week who deals with sexual addiction, and I just asked him, like, do you think you're ever going to have a day where it's not a temptation? And he said, I don't know. Maybe not. And for a brief moment, I thought, well, that defies everything that I'm suggesting Jesus is saying, that he can change our character. And then it hit me, no. Paul says the fruit of the Holy Spirit is self-control, not an absence of things, but the ability to get ourselves to obey. And so if you're someone that struggles with this stuff, okay, honestly, you may have made enough decisions in your past that just like someone who smokes for decades is going to live with those, you might have to live with some consequences for the rest of your life, but that's okay. The question is, what are you going to do with your heart? And are you going to continue to be a person of self-control? It doesn't have to be about shame. Listen, if Jesus is who he says that he is, then he understood something I think remarkable about our culture, and that is your sexuality is not inconsequential. It is at the center of who you are, the center of how you treat people, the center of what motivates you, the center of what makes you who you try to be.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.